In the last lesson, we learned about the fundamentals of using scope slots and how they help us solve the problem of accessing our child's data inside of a slot template. In this lesson, I'll be covering some constraints that you should be aware of when using scope slots, as well as some alternative syntax that you should be aware of and might encounter in other codebases. Let's get started. As a quick overview, in our book.vue component, we have a book title property inside of our data store that's populating the book title attribute for our slot name title. The book title prop here is then exposed inside of slot props, which then allows us to render it using slotprops.booktitle. And so the question we want to answer here is why it is called scope slots. The reason it is called scope slots is because our slot props are scoped only to the template block. Let me illustrate this a bit more. In the event we want to create a computed property called uppercase title inside of our library.vue component, we might try something like this. We try to access the slot props like we would any other property inside of our library component. Unfortunately, this won't work because, as I mentioned earlier, our slot props are scoped only to the template block. In other words, it can't be accessed outside of it. While this may seem like an inconvenience, this actually helps developers ensure that they keep the concerns of each component in the right place. In other words, rather than creating a computed property on library.vue, it would actually be better to create it on book.vue instead and expose that via slot props. And so, to reinforce this concept once more, any data exposed through slot props is scoped only to the slot template and nothing more. A common desire amongst developers is to make their code more concise. In other words, less code to read and less code to type. And because slot props ultimately results in a JavaScript object, we can utilize ES6 destructuring to make our code a little more readable. Using ES6 destructuring, we can take our slot props and only extract the value we care about, which in this case is book title. As a result, inside of our H1, we can now eliminate our slot props and simply use book title. And with that, our code's a little bit cleaner and hopefully a little bit easier to read. In the last lesson, remember how I said that the vslot directive can only be applied to the template element? Technically, I lied. There is an exception to this rule, and we're going to go over it right now. So when a component is being used with only a single slot, just like our book component with the sole title slot, we can actually shortcut how it's written inside of library.vue. We can actually apply vslot directly onto the component and remove the template blocks. However, let's say that our book.vue component had an additional slot that is name description. Looking at the abbreviated syntax on the left, we might be tempted to then add a template block inside of our book component that has vslot description, as we've done earlier. But this will not work. The moment you need more than one slot, you must go back to using template blocks, just like we did before. As a result, because this isn't immediately intuitive, I personally recommend just sticking with template blocks even if you only have one slot. And with that, you're now fully equipped to use scope slots inside of your vue.js apps while understanding some alternative syntaxes you might encounter in other codebases. See you in the next lesson. And with that, you're now fully equipped to use scope slots inside of your vue.js apps while Oh no! What happened?